Welcome to Best of the Solari Report, the 2017 wrap-ups. In the last few weeks of the year, we revisit the best of that year. We want to make sure you have the opportunity before the year is out to really hear the best that we've produced over the year. In January, we're going to publish our annual wrap-up for 2017, and it's going to reflect the very rich discussions we've had during 2017. Each wrap-up comes with a theme where we take a deep dive on a very important topic that we think you need to understand to see the deeper news. Then we do news, trends, and stories, both a web presentation with our roundup of the top trends and stories, and then a discussion with Dr. Joseph Farrell. And then finally, we produce the financial charts to see what's been going on in terms of price in the markets, and I give an equity overview. So the wrap-up breaks down to 3 or 4 sections where we go through the deep dive on the theme, the news, trends, and stories, and the equity overview. I'm going to review the video excerpts. We call them Just a Taste. Whenever we publish a Solari Report, we have a short video with an excerpt. And what we've done is we've collected together the Just a Taste for the wrap-up during the year and published them as one segment so you can get a really great overview. We started the year with the January 2017 annual wrap-up for 2016 called The Global Harvest and What It Means to Investors. Food is a critical part of our lives, our economy, and of the investment markets, and for a variety of reasons which we explained in Global Harvest, I think the role of food is going to become steadily more important. And so I wanted to focus you on the role of agriculture and food, particularly throughout the investment community, and that includes your family budget. We started with the theme, The Global Harvest, where we went through food, but we also looked at scenario designs. I like to do scenarios in the first part of the year so that whether for strategic planning or portfolio strategy, we have a way of approaching an uncertain future. And this was a big annual report in January 2017 for me because for many, many years, I've been saying, the economy is just going to slow burn. And I changed that for the first time that we've been producing the annual wrap-up and said, something, the slow burn is coming to an end. We're starting into controlled demolitions. And sure enough, that's what happened throughout the year. Those controlled demolitions and the process is very important for you to understand. I said that we were coming through the end of the financial coup period. The consolidation was underway, and this was going to accelerate the shift from what I call Global 2.0 to Global 3.0, really from an industrial economy to a networked economy. I think the cryptocurrencies is a very important part of that, and the Amazon phenomena is a very important part of that. So we talk about coming out of that financial coup, and then the big question, how will we manage the liabilities left in the industrial economy, particularly the pension and retirement funds, now that the assets have been shifted? Our main theme, the global food harvest and what it means to investors. Food is at the heart of the question I asked throughout the next 4 weeks and throughout our written presentation for the 2016 annual wrap-up. Can we rebuild our local economies as we re-engineer government budgets from a negative return on investment to a positive return on investment? There is an urgency to this question as the heat is turned up in the slow burn, and now with the U.S. presidential election behind us, we enter the pressure cooker of ongoing controlled demolitions of financial liabilities that cannot be funded, of pension funds cutting benefits, insurance companies canceling policies, and businesses laying off large numbers of employees, closing down or declaring bankruptcy. For many years, we've talked about the financial coup d'etat moving assets out of existing systems before the boomers retired into what I call Global 3.0. Last year, we focused on space as an important area in Global 3.0, where I believe some of those resources are being invested. This year, we focus on the end game in the existing government and legacy systems, or what I call Global 2.0. The financial coup d'etat has moved the assets out while leaving the liabilities behind. Now pension funds and retirement systems, as well as governments throughout the developed world, must manage their way through trains of obligations that are coming due. However we manage the relations between creditors, retirees, shareholders, and taxpayers, whether at the local, state, or national, or even corporate level, the bottom line is we will all do much better if we stopped wasting time and resources and combine the best of traditional ideas as well as new technology to significantly improve our productivity. As we discussed with John Rappaport, Can We Make America Great Again? There is an enormous opportunity to do so. However, whether it is the president-elect asking questions about why we're spending $4 billion on Air Force One, or a CalPERS pension beneficiary asking why their benefits are being cut 60% from $49,000 to $19,000 a year with very little warning, the time has come to ask very serious questions about how the money works around us, to do what we can to make it work better, and to be prepared to shine the light and deal effectively with those who steal, waste, and shrink the pie. For the first time after many years of annual wrap-ups, I'm not going to tell you that there is a good chance we will slow burn through the next year. Change is here, and while 2017 is a transition year, the variability of what could happen over the next few years is high. The heat is turning up, we are headed into the pressure cooker, and it is our choice as to whether we cook up a positive, human-friendly future or not. After the first part of the annual wrap-up, we focused on news, trends, and stories with Dr. Joseph Farrell. One of the things we focused on was the danger of privatization and the continued engineering of uneconomic support into the large corporations by the political process. And this time we began our focus, which you've heard from us all year. The concern for the push for a constitutional convention will be hijacked to ensure much greater, quote, privatization, not just at the federal level, but state and local, and how so many of the problems that we're facing come from a failure to enforce the Constitution. Our problems can't be solved by changing it. It can be solved by forcing it. Privatization. I do want to talk a little bit about privatization because I think it is one of the big risks we face. And if you look at some of the politicking in Congress, I'm particularly worried about where Congress may try and force things. Privatization is when you privatize something at a below market price. So you transfer an asset or an operation to a private sector where they're getting a windfall benefit because it's not done at market, or you're transferring a liability back into government, again, without providing a market compensation for it. And so you're using these changes to basically subsidize and create windfall profits to the private sector in a way that we know Congress loves to do. That's how they get campaign donations from capital gains to private investors, corporations, and private parties. And the reason I bring up privatization, and I'm particularly nervous about it, is one, if you don't have a lot of experience on Wall Street in Washington, it's hard to figure out what's legitimate privatization versus what's privatization. So it's hard to kind of track and see and prevent. And needless to say, the pirates are paid millions of dollars a year to be very clever at figuring it out. But the thing that concerns me the most on this is we're seeing real pushes on the Republican side for a constitutional convention, which I think is a very, very bad idea.
Well, I'm in 150% agreement with you there. I think it's a colossally bad idea. Because, again, my lesson from history is that the 1787 Philadelphia Convention, Constitutional Convention, they were supposed to have gone there and tinker with the Articles of Confederation. And what they gave us was a whole new Constitution. So I am totally in agreement with you there. This is a colossally bad idea because if they did this, I suspect that what you would get out of it is precisely some sort of constitution that would legitimize and legalize privatization at every level, not just federal,
yes,
but state and local.
Right.
So in other words, think of post-Soviet Yeltsin Russia on steroids.
Right.
This would be a disaster for the country. It would be a disaster for the world economy. There's no way I trust the Jeb Bushes and the Republican leadership that's pushing for this to come up with anything that would be a legitimately needed constitutional change for the welfare of the people of the country. No way. No way.
And then our final piece was an equity overview. We step back and look at the full year of 2016. And I continue to bring you back to what I think is one of the most important trends of the next few decades, and that is planet equity, the conversion of the global financial model from a debt-based one to one more focused on equity, and the multiple forces driving a long-term bull market in global equities. And of course, the danger being we have very differing deep models on our economy and how we run our politics, and the danger of real clashes in those models. The arguments that a bull market can continue are, first, the one I described in the 2014 annual wrap-up. Planet equity, there is a plan globally to build out the global securities and equities markets. Privatization is at the root of it, so we're trying to grow the corporate model, if you will. And so what we've watched for the last 20 years is a shift of assets out of governments into the hands of corporations, and it's part of growing the equity market. So I think that's going to continue because it's a very important strategic top-down decision. But second of all, the fixed income market is double what the equity markets are. And with what I think is the end of the long-term bull in bonds, we're going to see a shift of money out of the bond markets and into equities. I don't see any place else for those funds to go. And now that the central banks have printed, there's an awful lot of cash sloshing around. And there's every indication that the central banks and governments are going to continue to intervene to maintain it. Finally, new technology, if applied properly, if we could get out of all these win-lose problems in the economy, new technology can bring explosive value throughout the equity market. So if you look at all those different reasons, planet equity, privatization, shifts of fund from fixed income, commitments of central banks and government pools of capital, and new technology, it's a lot of force behind supporting a long-term bull market in equities. The arguments against it is we are watching a real battle of models in the global economy, global geopolitics, and domestic. It's if you read the productivity piece that I did for the second quarter wrap-up, if you read what I've written about the shift from Global 2.0 to 3.0, if we talk about moving from a unipolar to a multipolar world. And I think what's come out on the American campaign for president is that ultimately at the root of the big model discussion in the developed world is, are we going to have a human society or an inhuman society? And I make no bones about it. I think the leadership is pushing for an inhuman society, and that is causing tremendous backlash in a variety of ways. So when you have a win-lose relationship between many different players on the global stage and between the leadership in the G7 nations and the people in the G7 nations, that has devastating impacts on both living equity and place-based equity and broad-based productivity. Until that battle of the models gets sorted out, you're going to have tremendous waste. And that's certainly what we're watching in the American economy. Our first quarter had us looking at the new U.S. administration. It's called The Clash of Civilizations. We published it in April 2017. And our subtitle is, Can a New Administration Preserve a Prosperous Economy Without More Debt, Crime, and a War? We saw a major competition during the campaign between a faction of the deep state that wanted to sacrifice the empire to make sure that the United States and North America was secure, versus a group that was willing to sacrifice the United States to make sure the global empire was secure. We know who won, and the question was, how would this translate into real policies? Joseph Farrell and John Rappaport and I had several conversations coming into the April 2017 first quarter wrap-up about the administration and the leadership being recruited and how things were evolving. And so in our clash of civilization, we ended up discussing, among other things, the squabble to blame Russia for Trump's election and the deterioration that's been going on for some time between Russia and the United States. And Joseph focused us on the cultural tensions between Russia and the U.S. that are very old, even ancient. And we discussed our dependency on force as opposed to inspiration globally to lead. And also Putin's Christmas speech, which was remarkable for calling out the cultural corruption in the West, including pedophilia.
Western Christians don't understand orthodoxy. They just don't, because it's a totally different way of thinking about the fundamental doctrines of the religion. But the other thing is, we need to remember that Russia, as a nation, was midwifed into existence by orthodoxy. So it is so deeply suffused in Russian culture. I think this is a large part of the anti-Russian hysteria. People just don't understand.
We are watching a war on cash globally coming out of Davos in the United States.
Yep.
And Russia clearly stands in the way of a global cash control, global digital payment system.
Right.
That's number one. Number two, if we're going to control from space, they're a threat.
Yep, exactly.
Because they have the capabilities of playing in space with weapon technology in a very major way.
Yep.
The third thing is they have played the soft revolution card brilliantly, and we have failed completely.
Yes.
Mattis, in his testimony as his nominee hearing for Secretary of Defense, said, to project power, we need military power. And he didn't use the word soft revolution, but soft revolution power. And he said on soft revolution, you need inspiration. And we are way too dependent on force, and we're short inspiration. President
Putin gave a Christmas message that I wish people would go watch. He addressed certain cultural trends in the West, particularly during the Obama years. The whole transgender bathroom thing and everything else. And he directly addressed the immigration crisis in Russian terms by saying, we need, of course, to continue to protect the rights of minorities in Russia, but we will never allow the culture of the majority to become hijacked by minorities. Not just people inside of Russia. He was addressing the West and to people in the West that have watched this multicultural agenda erode the institutions and landmarks and monuments of their civilization.
Right. The other thing you brought up, and I thought was very powerful, is pedophilia as the ultimate example that documents their debasement.
Yep.
And I think that goes right at the heart of the Anthony Weiner laptop. We then turned to news trends and stories, and one of our challenges, the news was pretty depressing at that point, and one of the things I asked Joseph was what he found inspiring, and we discussed the Panhandle fires. 2017 has been marked by fires and disasters. It's a big theme throughout the year. We saw fires in Montana, Washington, California, as well as several southern European countries, very suspicious patterns. And of course, weather warfare devastating the Caribbean, Florida, and Houston. But the first big fire of the year was the Panhandle fires, and as terrible as those fires were, the way that the people in the Panhandle handled them was very inspiring. And of course, it brought out the question of why the fake news is really not covering these unbelievably important events.
Of all the things that inspired you in the first quarter, what inspired you the most?
I'll be honest with you here. Until I saw your outline, I was struggling to find out something in the news that did. But when I read this article about fellow Texans coming to the rescue after the fire devastates the Panhandle, that was it.
Uh-huh.
You mentioned to me the fact that this effort has received no attention from the national corporate-controlled lamestream media.
It's so amazing, Joseph, to see the drivel and the irrelevancy and all the stuff that's pouring out of the shriekometer. And there you have all these ranchers and livestock and 1 million acres. That is a huge fire.
Yep.
And not a word. It's like it doesn't exist.
Yep. Well, the thing that got me about that was inspiring was the fact that it wasn't covered by the mainstream corporate-controlled media. Because if you have a bunch of people banding together to solve a problem without the involvement, apparently, of the state authorities or of the local authorities and just going out and doing it.
It's not just a few people. You're talking about thousands of volunteer fire people, the sheriff, the sheriff's office, the ranchers, everybody working together. One of the ranchers wrote me and said, you know, the popsicle index is still 100% in the Panhandle.
Yep. Well, that's why they didn't cover it, because this was not a centralized government FEMA solution to a problem. This was people saying, forget about the government, forget about the emergency declarations from the governor or the president or what have you. They just went out and did it. And, you know, we were talking earlier about when you and I were in school, elementary and junior high school, we learned about the old barn raising parties that people on the frontier back in the 19th century would have. They would get together and build a barn for a farmer in the area. You know, everybody'd bring potluck dinner. The men would put up the barn. The women would cook the dinner. The children would play. And at the end of the day, you had a barn.
Right.
And, you know, that was a local solution, everybody chipping in, buying the materials and so on and so forth. That was a local solution to a local problem. Totally, completely bypassing any government. And this is what they've done in the Panhandle. That's why it's not on the news, and that's why it's significant.
Finally, in the first quarter equity overview, I revisited the scenario designs that we did in the annual wrap-up and talked about some of the key variables, including, are we moving to a multipolar world from a unipolar world, or can the unipolar world hold? Very important in terms of strategic planning and portfolio strategy as to which strategy you take. And then, of course, the big question, can we turn the U.S. budget to a positive return on an investment from a negative return, particularly on domestic spending? And one of the things I've said is that this is why the campaign got so heated. The debt growth model is over, and now all money is real money, and you've got to get performance. Performance matters. You can't just print more money willy-nilly. When you do scenario design, you pick out key variables, and then you have a range of those variables. It's always done in quadrants. So you have two axes. One is vertical, one is horizontal. And the crossing of those two creates 4 quadrants. And so the idea is to identify the key variables that will sort of drive things one way or another. And the 2 key variables are 2 that we've talked about a lot over the last year. One is multipolar versus unipolar. Are we going to live in a unipolar world? Are we going to live in a multipolar world? Now, you would think, given what we've seen over the last year and in the election, well, certainly, Catherine, we're going to go to a multipolar world. And it certainly looks like that. My only concern is a unipolar world could still reassert itself by global investors working through multiple countries, getting tight control of the digital systems and space weaponry. We still don't know who Mr. Global is and what Mr. Global's resources are. So I think the chances of a unipolar U.S. world, a U.S.-dominated world, are certainly not what they were 5 years ago, but I don't underestimate Mr. Global's ability to centralize and create a command and control system, and that's what I'm more worried about. So the vertical axis is political and economic alignment, and it can be multipolar or unipolar. And then the horizontal axis is the other key variable, which is positive or negative return on investment to taxpayers. So is government money spent in a productive way with integrity and competence, or is it spent in a corrupt or incompetent way? Particularly because the U.S. budget has such a dramatic impact on all the financial markets globally and a lot of the cash flows. It's the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and it needs to be significantly re-engineered. And that was part of why the debate in this campaign, to my surprise, got very real, because the debt growth model is over, the money's over, and so now you're going to have to get down and start really performing. Our second quarter wrap-up was called Enforce the Constitution or Kiss Your Money Goodbye. There's a great picture of George Washington on the cover with a big pink kiss on his face. We published this in July 2017, and I had increasingly become focused on the need to enforce throughout the last few years, but it really reached a point where I said, okay, I need to focus our subscribers on this because we all need to take action. The lawlessness that is repeatedly causing problems in terms of managing people's assets or their day-to-day lives is reaching a tipping point, and we really are at a point where we have to take action. And I decided the person who could best help me explain the role of the Constitution, the importance of it, the importance of enforcing it, was someone who had deep congressional experience, Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney, who's now a professor teaching in Bangladesh. And so with her permission, I flew to Bangladesh to get the interview because we needed to talk seriously, and we talked for a week before we recorded it. I recorded it on my last full day there. And it was a remarkable experience and absolutely worth flying all the way to Bangladesh to get. As I said, if we want to protect our lives, our rights, our financial assets, up against this lawlessness, we need to enforce the Constitution. There was this very long and serious conversation, and the Just to Taste excerpt we pulled out was also very long, but it's a sobering and very important call to action. And I think it's exceptionally important that each subscriber hear it. If you're a new subscriber, this will give you an opportunity to hear it. So Enforce the Constitution with Cynthia McKinney, who has served very honorably in Congress and has done remarkable and fearless things on many issues, including the missing money. So you have a machinery where a group of people in the deep state can basically print or borrow an infinite amount of money and spend it on a non-disclosed basis completely outside of the Constitution. And this allows them literally to run an entire planet by force.
Absolutely. And to do anything else with the money. That's how you get whole pallets of U.S. dollars sent to Iraq.
Right.
It's ridiculous.
Right.
It's outrageous. And I've been outraged for a very long time.
Mr. Secretary, according to the Comptroller General of the United States, there are serious financial management problems at the Pentagon, to which Mr. Cooper alluded. Fiscal year 1999, 2.3 trillion missing. Fiscal year 2000, 1.1 trillion missing. And DOD is the number one reason why the government can't balance its checkbook. The Pentagon has claimed year after year that the reason it can't account for the money is because its computers don't communicate with each other. My second question, Mr. Secretary, is who has the contracts today to make those systems communicate with each other? How long have they had those contracts? And how much have the taxpayers paid for them? Finally, Mr. Secretary, after the last hearing, I thought that my office was promised a written response to my question regarding the 4 war games on September 11th. I have not yet received that response, but would like for you to respond to the questions that I've put to you today, and then I do expect the written response to my previous question, hopefully by the end of the week.
The second question, I've forgotten what the second question was.
I think Ms. Jonas knows it.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. McKinney. I appreciate the question. I appreciate your interest in our department's financial condition, and we are working very hard on that program. I've just come back recently this
I understand that you're working hard on it,
Yes.
but my question was, who has the contract? How long have they had that contract? And how much money have we spent on it?
In general, we spend about $20 billion in the Department on information technology systems. The accounting systems are part of that. I can get you the exact number for the record of what we spend on our current, what we call legacy systems, and those that we're moving toward.
And who has the contracts?
That would be a multitude of individuals.
Could you name some, please?
Well, I think off the top of my head, well, I would rather not. I'd rather provide that for the record.
That's not privileged information, is it?
I'm sure it's not.
Well, please. Yeah. And we still have time, so please.
Well, what we're saying is the appropriation clause and the war powers clause in combination are not being enforced, and unless they are enforced, you're literally seeing a machinery that's going to destroy the planet.
Absolutely. So, I agree with you.
Right. And part of our challenge is to change that. It's going to take all of us, and not just in the United States, but globally.
The people of the United States have a huge responsibility to hold their government accountable, because all roads lead to Washington, D.C.
Right.
And if Washington, D.C. is messed up, then the rest of the world is so messed up.
The bank depository and all the financial servicing and other work is done through the New York Fed member banks for the U.S. government. So the U.S. government doesn't have its own bank accounts. It banks with all the New York Fed member banks, and the Exchange Stabilization Fund, its slush fund, is run by the New York Fed member banks as agent, and all of its information systems, unfortunately, now are run by the big defense contractors with those banks. And so it doesn't have information or financial sovereignty, and part of enforcing the Constitution is getting that back.
It absolutely doesn't have information sovereignty, and instead, what you've got is the Fed claiming its sovereignty,
right,
distinct and separate from the United States government.
I would say we have a few structural problems. Now, why is this important to you? So what happens if we don't enforce the Constitution, but in fact change it? Let me talk numbers, because since 1998, $40 trillion has disappeared in bailouts and missing money, and even more in quantitative easing. I could take this number, I could estimate it up to $100 trillion. So now they have $40 trillion, but that's not on the balance sheet. However, if you look at the law, our property, your property, my property, our retirement savings is on the balance sheet. So one of the things the Constitutional Convention is trying to do is to push a balanced budget amendment. Well, if we're going to balance the budget with our retirement savings and property on budget, but the $40 trillion they just stole off budget, guess what's going to happen?
Right. Okay. And the people pay the ultimate price, as always. So our part of what we have to demand is that we want that money back. We want that money back for our infrastructure, for our children, for education, for everything that has gone undone and stolen.
So let me just make this point. People always say, oh, well, it's gone, we can't get it back. Not true. That's not true. That money went someplace, and now there are assets that exist. And the ownership interest in those assets can be back on the table.
Well, they should be back on the table. And this is what partially got me into trouble, is that then I said, okay, well, let me start calling names. Right. And it's very important for us to call names, because if you make it a charge or an attack and it's not a direct hit, it goes over people's heads.
Right.
And so you've been engaged in this conversation for 30 years.
Right.
I've only started the conversation last year, or maybe some people started it in 2001 with September 11th.
Right.
So there's a whole body of knowledge out there that I don't have. So really, you don't have the luxury of trying to educate me by going over my head. If you really want me to get it, you got to hit directly. And
Okay.
that's why calling names becomes important.
Okay, which brings us to our next topic, slug management. So
I just pour salt on mine.
One of my simple constructs is that in any community, in any country, in any organization, any business, 10% of the people are what I would call net energy plus. They give more than they take. Those are your entrepreneurs. So you're net energy plus. Then 80% are followers. They just follow around whoever is in charge. They're busy. They're having kids. They're doing whatever. Some of us go back and forth between being followers and net energy plus. And then you have a group I call the net energy minus, and my nickname for them are the slugs. The slugs always drain. And some of the slugs are scorpions, which mean they enjoy draining. They enjoy busting things. They enjoy breaking things, making them not work. And the slugs will always be with us. And I grew up in a neighborhood in West Philadelphia, and it was a very multiracial, multicultural, multi-religion. But all the different people, the net energy plus people, could figure out who each other was, and they would organize to do slug management very quietly because they could cut off the slugs' money. But then when government money and the drugs came in, the net energy plus people lost the ability to cut off the slugs' money. The rich and powerful slugs figured out how to use, sort of the local slugs. So part of our problem is slug management, because basically what we've done is we've allowed a group, networks of people, to get the bit in their teeth, and they are running a system where they're centralizing power and political and economic power, and it's shrinking the total pie. But they don't care because they're slugs.
They don't care one whit.
Right.
So now it's interesting that we're having this discussion because I introduced a new word to my political science students, and that word is kakistocracy. So that is leadership, governance by the least qualified, the most corrupt, the most vile kinds of personalities are the ones that are able to claw their way to the top.
Right.
And so this phenomenon of kakistocracy then led me to consider the entire scenario in a republic is that I'm a sovereign individual and I take my sovereignty and I give it to someone else, and then I beg them, please do this for me, please do that for me. Right. And so maybe built into that particular power configuration is this inability to control the slugs.
Right. So let's talk about a very important thing. You said we got to name names. So let's talk about who the slugs are. And they're different, they're different constructs. One, you have this construct of the pilgrims and the ziocons, which I think is very useful and very interesting because you're basically targeting two power groups. So the ziocons is a mixture of Zionists and neocons, and then the pilgrims are like the old line wasps. And we've seen power bounce around back and forth between these two groups. And there's no doubt about it. Part of what we're watching is a sort of integrated merger of the pilgrims and the ziocons. I call them the neocons, but we're looking at this merger, and at the root of it, it's basically an organized crime model. But I would say, and the reason I use the term Scorpio, to me, they are demonic. And so, I don't know if you've ever seen the movies Eyes Wide Shut, but these are people who go off and they do Luciferian. So we're talking about some pretty perverted stuff here. But maybe if you could just say a few words about the ziocons and the pilgrims and what you saw in 12 years in Congress.
Well, I came up with the pilgrims and the ziocons because I was trying to understand what I was witnessing and what I was experiencing when I was in Congress. And there was that level of contention that was going on for who's actually going to control the reins of the state and all of the powers of the governing apparatus of the United States of America. What I believe is that there was a point at which the Pilgrims and the Ziocons, they shared a mission.
Right.
Now, according to Dr. Peter Turchin, who comes up with this idea of cliodynamics, where he tries to mathematize history. So he says that at one point you have a united deep state. Then the apparatus of the state is incapable of satisfying in periods of boom all of the power demands of every individual that's in the deep state.
Right.
So then that's when you see the factionalization taking place. So this is where we are, I believe, now.
When I say the debt growth model is over, what I'm saying is the spigot of infinite free money is over, and now I call it the Midianite thing. The fighting is beginning because there's not enough juice to satisfy all the criminals.
That's right.
Okay, so I have a very famous story where I was in a meeting with Jack Kemp, and Jack Kemp said, the law, I don't have to obey the law. I report to something higher, And what he was implying is, if you watch again Eyes Wide Shut, that there's this group of secret societies, and they are above the law.
Mm-hmm.
And we saw...
Well, we've seen that. Why isn't Hillary Clinton before the ICC? Why isn't she even before the New York courts? I mean, why is she... this is a woman who is a serial criminal.
Right.
And yet, as you say, crime that pays is crime that stays.
Right. So let's give an example of some of the people. So some of the neocons are pretty much named, but if you look at Congress, I mean, the Ziocons are in full blossom. So I'm thinking of Lindsey Graham. I'm thinking of John McCain. I'm thinking of Chuck Schumer. I mean, one thing I'll give Chuck Schumer credit, he explained the issue. He got on TV and basically said the president can't buck the intelligence agencies because they'll get you.
That's right. They have 24 ways to Sunday
to get you.
Yeah.
And what Chuck Schumer was saying was, we're not obeying the Constitution because the president does not. If you look at the powers and authorities of the president, he doesn't have any of that. He does what he's told by the intelligence agencies, which is in fact how it's been working since they shot John F. Kennedy, in broad daylight. Now, I have a theory, and that is the Pilgrims, when I sort of started moving up the system, the Pilgrims were in control, but they used the Ziocons to do their dirty tricks. And, if they wanted wholesale criminality to pool a lot of capital, they would use the Ziocons to do it.
Well, then that was their slug management.
Right.
And then something happened.
Right. Well, you'll see throughout history, whenever you depend on somebody to operationalize it, at some point they lever up their power. So we go through the bailouts, suddenly, $27 trillion gets stolen, and suddenly the Ziocons are no longer doing the dirty tricks. They're at the table.
That's right.
Right. Well, part of it is in 95, it was made very clear to me that the Pilgrims decided they were giving up on the country. They were pulling all their money out. That was part of the financial coup d'etat and getting all the money out. The question, of course, where are you going to go? The other thing I wanted to do is talk about the role of Israel. There was, I think in the 90s, one of the head of the FBI said that Israel was the greatest threat to national security of this country. But what we're watching within the Ziocons, there's a very strong relationship between the Ziocons and Israel's governmental capacity, so the Mossad and the defense industry, everything. But we are watching an explosion of government officials, politicians, people in the military who have dual citizenship.
Yes, and it's a problem. Under Putin's leadership, the Duma passed a rule saying that no Duma member could have dual citizenship. So you're at least loyal to Russia if you're going to serve, in quotation marks, Russia. So the situation is not the same in the U.S. And therefore, we can get someone like a Rahm Emanuel who served with me and then who organized to make sure that I was kicked out of the Congress while he was in charge of the DCC, that served in the Israeli Defense Forces, but not in the U.S. military.
Well, the one I'm thinking of is Dov Zakheim, who was instrumental in the undocumentable adjustments at the DOD and sort of papering it over. And again, dual citizenship. Here's why this is all important. What you're talking about is with both the Pilgrims and the Ziocons is getting a relatively small group of people together and through the federal credit mechanism and the subversion of the war clause, giving them the machinery that gives them the ability to institute violence under the rule of law globally on a non-transparent basis.
Right, on a non-transparent basis. But I say that the Ziocons don't care about the survival of the U.S. Why else would they push war against Russia? Maybe Russia, China, and Iran and Hezbollah together, and the United States can't win that war and shouldn't even fight it.
But if the U.S. and Russia destroy each other,
right, then they are ascendant. Be it from Israel or wherever. So they've got a place in mind, but they all have second passports. That's right.
We then moved into news, trends, and stories for the second quarter wrap-up that we did in two sections. The first, in part one, I focused Dr. Farrell on the exceptional divergence of Fortune 500 revenues with the GNP. There used to be an expression in America that what was good for General Motors was good for America. And what this chart shows is a real divergence. So you see the corporations subsidized enormously by government, both government contracts, government subsidies, government policies taking up a much greater part of the market share. And part of this is also the growth of AI and algorithms and software and the use of manipulation of the market. So he and I discuss the push for greater corporate market share and control and the role that war on cash plays in this. Again, we come back to the idea that with the end of the debt growth model, you can't solve political problems just by printing money. And one of the things I keep focusing on is in this shift of Global 2.0 to 3.0, it's a different kind of person who reinvests the money than steals the money. And you've got a whole lot of very rich, expensive people who are not productive. They're very good at stealing, but they're not good at reinvestment. And we should expect purges. And sure enough, that's what we've seen towards the end of the year, the beginning of extraordinary purges. And we come back again to the risk of war, but the reality that we have significant leadership that believes that war is the way to keep the economy and corporate profits going. In June, on June 15th, Fortune published a review of the Fortune 500, and it showed a chart, Joseph, that I wanted to tell you about it, starting in 1955 and until 1995. So for 40 years, the GDP of the U.S. and the valuation of, or the Fortune 500 revenues sort of moved up together. They were almost in perfect alignment. And then the World Trade Organization goes into effect in 1995, and the financial coup begins with money disappearing from the federal government. And suddenly, the Fortune 500 revenues explode. And as of 2017, the GDP is up 4,600%, but the Fortune 500 revenues are up 9,000%. And that is a giant sucking sound of every ounce of economic value from the real economy into this, the planet equity. And, some of that is legitimate stuff and some of it's not. It's our old friend, the highly levered company coming in with a high PE and sucking up all the market share locally in a way that shrinks the total pie.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
This is a computer-generated casino, and the thing about these flash crashes, the other thing that I think that I need to mention here is I have this strong suspicion, and it's been increasing every time I see these flash crashes occur, that what you're looking at is a system that may be showing all the signs of an artificial intelligence, because increasingly the quants, the people that have designed and run these high-frequency trading dark pools, even they admit they no longer really know what's going on. So to me, that's kind of a tongue-in-cheek way of saying, well, the system has woken up and it's driving itself. So to me, this changes the investment culture, and this is what I think you've said so many times about decentralization. Can we relocalize? And I think increasingly people are going to have to be aware of, if they're investing in some project locally or regionally, they're going to have to be aware of to what extent is a company or partnership that they might be considering going into business with, to what extent is that group or company exposed to these national markets that are so manipulable and manipulated by these computerized trading systems. I think that's going to be, like you say, the great sucking sound, and that's the way they're going to try and suck even more wealth out locally. So that's a strategy, I think, that we're going to increasingly have to be aware of.
Right. Well, that's the war on cash. That's
the war on cash. Precisely.
That's pushing the war on cash. The thing that concerns me is there was an excellent article in The Economist about 6 months ago called In Retreat, about the fact that multinational companies had steadily dropping margins and were getting a lot more competition locally all over the world, including in the United States, and their revenues are falling. And in fact, if you look at this Fortune 500 chart for about a year or two, sure enough, revenues are falling. And this is happening in combination with what you and I have talked about at the end of the debt growth model. And Cynthia McKinney and I talked about it, and it's in the little video we put up for the second quarter wrap-up this week, where we said, the problem is now you've got all these rich criminal slugs, and now that things are shrinking, the game is sort of winding down. They're fighting over the pie, and the pie is shrinking, and it's turning mean. And to me, the big danger here is war, because I think one of the reasons the press for a bigger military budget and the press for war is they see war as the only way to compete back into the game.
Right. And that's all the more reason, again, that people with money to invest and time to invest need to start thinking in local and regional terms, and to be very careful about with whom they're dealing with.
Right.
In News, Trends, and Stories Part 2, Joseph focuses us on a topic that he and I come back to often, which is the role of the Vatican and the Vatican Bank in the central banking system, in a new financial system, as well as the hidden system of finance that Joseph has talked and written so much about. And if we're going to evolve the financial system in a human direction, that means we have to understand the role of the Vatican and the Vatican Bank, and how, along with the two big pots that have to head in the right direction, the U.S. federal budget and the Vatican Bank.
They are trying, in my opinion, to position the Vatican to be one of the guarantor or participating central banks in a global currency. And by doing this, they're going to revive the old ancient practice that I talked about in Babylon's Banksters of the alliance between the bank and the temple. I think this is what their game plan is. The papacy would be in a position to give a unique moral sanction to whatever financial system Mr. Globaloney wants to put into place. I think this is why the papacy is being so heavily targeted with, basically, to be honest, Catherine, basically with a pope and a hierarchy that no longer subscribes to any sort of traditional Roman Catholic doctrine, from what I can tell. I think this is the game plan. This is a major thing. And of course, there will be backlash from traditional Catholics about it, and so on and so forth. But I think that's the game plan.
Well, clearly there is. The turmoil at the top of the Vatican is extraordinary. And every sign says to me they've got the same challenge of changing the model that we have with the U.S. federal budget. In other words, whether it's the Vatican or the U.S. federal budget, they're all a prisoner of the central banking warfare model. And the war to evolve that model is turning ugly. The Midianite thing is really upon us. And to me, it's one and the same.
It is one and the same for yet another reason, and I'm glad that you've mentioned this, because the Vatican Bank is, of course, kind of the central bank for the Roman Catholic Church. It's a very, very large institution. But the other thing about the Vatican Bank, of course, is that it is a papal patrimony. In other words, this is one of the key positions that the Pope has to fill with some member of the Cardinal Curate. And it looks to me that what they're trying to do, Catherine, is to use the Vatican Bank and its status to cloak financial activity. In other words, if you think it's difficult to get federal accountability under the constitutional provisions, budgetary provisions of where this money is going and what it's being spent for, think about the Vatican Bank, because literally anything in that bank's operation can, by order of the Pope, be hushed up. You're dealing, in other words, with a sovereign entity with even more sovereignty in a certain sense than the Bank of International Settlements.
Do the numbers. Just imagine the magic of compound interest when you don't have to pay taxes and you have diplomatic immunity for 2,000 years.
Well, not 2,000.
That's a lot of real estate.
It's not 2,000. The papal claims really begin to be asserted and exercised in their modern form in the 9th century. And there are reasons that happens. But, at least a millennium. And the problem here is, as you say, they essentially have been functioning as their own kind of very open, hidden economy, because they've exempted themselves, throughout history from secular taxation.
Well, I've always believed that the reason the Americans created the hidden system of finance after the war is to compete with the Vaticans. Right.
Yes, absolutely. It's not only competition, but in a certain sense, they've had to use the Vatican in that system.
Right.
So this is the Vatican is definitely plugged into it. If you don't believe me, folks, read Malachi Martin's novel called Vatican. It's a very historically based novel, and he goes into some details in that thing that will boggle the mind in terms of the financial arrangements. But this to me is the big cultural news, and it's bad news for traditional Catholics. I'll just put it that way. And they have my sympathy. They really do.
Finally, in the second quarter equity overview, I come back to the scenario designs we published in the 2016 annual wrap-up in January 2017. And I keep coming back, in addition to the long-term bull market and equities, primary trends, because when you have these dramatic shifts from global 2.0 to 3.0, there's a lot dying and a lot being born in the same market, and you need to see within the market and see those trends. If the per capita incomes in Asia are converging with the G7, whereas they're not necessarily throughout the emerging markets. So Asia is a very different pattern than the total emerging markets. And within that, there's the growth of the Asian consumer, which is going to be a primary trend for quite some time. And then space. I think that space is one of the great primary trends of our time, believing as I do that the reason we rushed globalization was to create the capacity to become a multiplanetary civilization. One of the things I stressed in the second quarter equity overview, and I continue to beat this drum, is we cannot predict the future. We need to have strategies, and we need to manage our time, our assets, to deal effectively with uncertainty and not get locked into thinking we can predict the future, getting locked into any particular picture of the future. I'm constantly trying to persuade Solari Report subscribers out of falling prey to the infinite amount of both fear porn and hope porn on the internet that locks you into different certainties about the future. The future's uncertain. We can't know what it is. We can be prepared for every different scenario, but I don't believe in prophecy. in the popsicle index rising scenario, corporate stocks are going to have, particularly ones that have a positive return and can function in lots of different political environments because they do have a positive return to both investors and the general economy, are going to be very good investments. Dividends are going to matter a lot. Now, also in this environment, because Asia is converging in terms of per capita income, riding the wave of the growth of the Asian consumer and that convergence, including the importance of the Asian space program. One of the things I'm doing is spending a lot of time working on looking for opportunities in space, because I think that that is going to be a major investment both in the developed countries and in Asia. But I say the same thing I say on all the scenarios. The best short-term investment opportunity is, in fact, there's no way to know. We are dealing with a very wide range of possibilities in different scenarios, and that's why you have to be prepared for significant volatility. For example, if you're in the domestic U.S. equity markets, we've got to go down more than 25%. 25% is a perfectly normal, healthy consolidation. It would be great for this market to do a 25% consolidation. The problem with how high we are now is we have to go down 30% before we know in a bear market and to get out. And it's one of the reasons why in the last year and a half, so much of my recommendations on equity have switched into hedged equity, where the hedges protect you on the drop. They drag your investment yields down. So if we had not been hedged, we would have done better over the last year and a half. But there's no way to know when that consolidation hits. So right now, I feel very, very conservative because we're levitating at very high valuations. Finally, in October 2017, we published Control 101, what it is, how it's used, how you can guard against it. The third quarter wrap-up was a major production experience for me. I was going to do the third quarter wrap-up on Go Local, and what I ran into was the frustration, yet again, as I have throughout the last 20 years, of not being able to reach a sensible consensus with key participants and colleagues, because we have a very different view of how control works. It's the sort of the meta-op underneath all ops, both all the control technologies, but particularly mind control technology, which is becoming much more economic and applied much more in the management of the general population, and is having devastating impacts on our society, and everyone in it, every subscriber is touched deeply by these kinds of invisible technologies, and it's wreaking havoc with our friends, our networks, and really causing divisions within the population. For the last 20 years, I've really been at odds with many financial commentators because I had a very different vision of how control worked. And I finally, about 10 years ago, just said, I have to go on my own. I have to just continue to say it's going to slow burn, and these various other, sort of scenarios of the future reflect an absence or really an absence of a willingness to look at control, how control of the people who manage the financial system is implemented, and how control of the markets are implemented. And so the big difference between me and so many other financial people was my vision of control, and of course, given my background, and then the 11 years I spent litigating with the federal government and dealing with a lot of the more gruesome parts of the control system, I really felt I had a depth of understanding on the control technologies, and I needed to find a way to sort of get that up and make it clear. Part of my frustration was listening to so many people describe why cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin were going to make us free. And of course, when you have a governance system which is controlled and managed by physical force, and it doesn't have integrity, it's operating outside the law, and it controls the financial and information systems, there's no way you can do something on the platforms that they control and think it's going to make a real difference, because in fact their real control comes from enormous amounts of physical force which back up mind control, financial incentives, all the various technologies. So I finally realized we've got to step back. We've got to take a very clear, coherent look at control and how it works and get into consensus. And part of it is control is first and foremost done through physical force. And we've been in the G7 nations in the developed world, we've been much more protected from that than they are in the emerging markets. But the iron fist is now coming out of the velvet glove, and so we need to see it because we're going to be grappling with more and more physical force and invasive force, particularly if we don't turn around. And if you tear down the Constitution, then we're talking about the application of major physical force, certainly in the United States.
The theme for the third quarter wrap-up is Control 101. I was going to do a third quarter wrap-up on Go Local, and what I discovered was, as has been for many decades now, every time I tried to discuss real solutions to how to gather power locally and decentralize whether economic or political power, the conversation breaks down because there's not a common understanding of how the control techniques work. I've run into this again and again for many decades because many financial commentators have said the markets are going to implode, and I say, no, they're not. They're going to slow burn because I understand how control works. That's the difference. It was not a different view of the financial markets. It was simply understanding how the people who manage the financial markets are controlled and how society can be controlled so that some groups can be composted to basically feed and keep the system going. After working with the outline for Control 101 for quite a long period now, I've been working on this for 3 months since the latest second quarter wrap-up, I decided to take a look at the most intimate level. If you look at my background, I started off deep inside the system, but also living in many cultures. I lived in a neighborhood that was way outside the establishment. So I went back and forth between many cultures, but I saw how things operated at a very deep and intimate level. Then when I left the Bush administration, I tried to create alternatives. I got kicked out of the system, and then I went from being a member of the predatory establishment to being prey. And I was able to succeed in the litigation and successfully survive that, which taught me a lot more about the covert side of the system. And then as I tried to build an independent operation to help other people also come out and be free outside the establishment, I just kept learning a tremendous amount, not just about control, which I knew a lot about before, but how difficult it was for people to fathom how the control system works. And so I've had a variety of experiences throughout our society that helps me understand control and how it impacts an individual at a very intimate level. So one of the things I decided to do is, in this theme, I would tell the stories of things that happened to me that helped me see different parts of it. And so it's important to me that you also are able to take this material and see it in an intimate level in your life, because intimacy is where we get the power. It's when we see how it operates in our lives that we have the power to shift our time, shift our attention, shift our admiration, shift our resources and our investments in a way that really can change things. So you get your power by seeing it at the intimate level. If there is one thing I would stress about our current control system, it is that it runs on force, and it always has. The people who control are those who can kill with impunity. Now, that force hides behind many, many invisible systems, whether they're the legal system, the financial system, fake news, mind control. We're going to touch on all of them in our discussion in the third quarter wrap-up. In essence, throughout society, you have many different industries and cartels competing to deliver control to Mr. Global. So the incentives are on for everyone. And so there are many different control systems, and there are many different faces in front of that force. But ultimately, it's force that controls. And it's interesting, if you live in many parts of the world outside the G7 nations, people are very clear that power runs and is backed up ultimately by force. But in the G7 nations, in the English-speaking world, we've had many, many years of not only peace, not war, but, we've gotten the velvet glove, the iron hand in the velvet glove. So I want to come back and make sure you see clearly that force and it's not hidden by all these different control systems. Finally, it's important to understand that our governance system is invisible to us. We can hypothesize about it, but it's still invisible, and we know it doesn't have integrity. What it says is the law and what's really happening are two very different things. And unfortunately, because of that, we have information systems and financial systems that also don't have integrity. If we want to bring integrity back, we have to ultimately deal with that issue of force and how we get the enforcement and the use of force back into alignment with the law. Because that's what it's going to take. And all these other different theories of how we can produce integrity in the systems aren't going to work. You can't bring integrity to the governance system by inventing a new financial product. All you can do is help Mr. Global, further centralize. Anyway, once you see it at an intimate level, there are many different things we can do to shift this. We have much power related to the fact that the centralizers are few and we are many. They come down to 4 areas, which we'll also touch on in the third quarter wrap-up. The first is prayer. We have to shift our consciousness. The second is transparency. We have to bring transparency. The third is shunning, and transparency is the condition precedent to shunning. Once the people who are acting outside of the law and bringing force with impunity can be clearly seen, we have the ability to shun them, which is a very powerful tool. And finally, we need to enforce the law and to integrate the law into our lives and in our communities around us. And that's part of what I was talking about in my section in the second quarter wrap-up on how to enforce the Constitution. So this is a very, very important conversation that we're having about Control 101. It goes right to the heart of what we have to turn to really turn the system towards one which is human and not inhuman. So, ladies and gentlemen, third quarter wrap-up, Control 101, in the hopes that it helps you lead a free and inspired life.
We then turned to news, trends, and stories with Dr. Farrell in the third quarter, and it was a particularly juicy conversation. There was so much happening. The news was so explosive. I just said to Joseph, I drove quite a ways so I could sit down with him in person, and I said, we've got to just focus on what's really important and tell me what you think is most important. And then it was great for my soul and great for my heart. He said, we've got to focus on the power and importance of the Constitution, not just as a legal mechanism, but as a covenant that we all share. And if we allow a constitutional convention, it can absolutely be torn up and we could lose our most basic human rights and property rights. And we come back, as we do throughout the year, the majority of problems in our society can be solved by enforcing Article 1 of the Constitution, both the Appropriation Clause and the War Clause. Okay, well, the first thing I wanted to bring up was, it's really funny, I came in and you said we have to really hammer on the Constitution.
Absolutely.
And I was thrilled because that's what I've been doing all quarter long, and I don't think it's sunk in yet.
No, what I do think people sense is the confusion. Since the election, we've seen what I think is kind of a revival of Weimar Germany. And by that I mean everybody is creating their private armies. Antifa and Black Lives Matter and all of these different groups, basically to go out and cause violence and wreak chaos and push a particular political agenda. But this really reached a head for me, as I think it probably did for most people, during the Charlottesville mess.
Right.
And what really became evident to me is in the aftermath of Charlottesville, then you had this sudden attack on American history and culture in the form of, well, let's tear down all these Confederate generals and so on. But now, and this has even reached where I live and probably where you live, now they're going after names of schools, and they're not limiting this anymore to leaders of the Confederacy. Now we're seeing people like Washington, Madison coming under attack, wanting to rename schools. Now, to me, what this whole agenda is it's the ultimate purpose of this is to get rid of the Constitution, because what they're going to do is they're going to say, well, this was a constitution created by a bunch of white males, landed property owners, and so on and so forth. And they're going to say the Constitution is no longer reflective of our modern values.
Right.
And we need to get
and our modern
technology and all of the class.
It's out of date. It's old.
It's out of date. It's old. It's part of a bygone era, and so on and so forth. So the culture war is being used, I think, to drive an agenda.
Right.
And the agenda is anti-Constitution.
Right.
And again, I'll say it. I've said it before. You and I have discussed this before. You turn over a constitutional convention to this current political class and this current popular culture, which does not understand these things.
Right.
And you're going to get a real mess.
Right.
You're no longer going to have the constitutional protections that you have.
Right.
So to me, this is a cultural agenda that is driving a political agenda.
The American people have lived their entire lives under the umbrella
Yes.
of the protection of the Constitution.
Right.
And even though it's been disrespected, even though it's been eroded, even though they've played all these games with national security, we have no concept of what it would be like if it wasn't there.
Absolutely.
Most Americans have no idea, despite all the erosion, what an obstacle it is for these folks.
So long as it is there as a governing document, a governing compact, there are a certain segment of people in the government, there are a certain segment of people in society, there's a certain segment of people in various corporations that are going to be obedient to it in a sincere fashion.
Right.
Remove that and put in something else that's concocted by social justice warriors, Antifa, and so on, to so to speak, update the Constitution. Remove that, and all of those protections disappear.
Right. And that includes the right to own property.
Yes, precisely. That includes the right to own property. If you remove that, one of the things the framers of the Constitution did in order to insist upon a continuation of the sovereignty of this nation was there is a clause in the Constitution that all of the debts incurred under the Articles of Confederacy would still be acknowledged under the new Constitution.
Right.
So in other words, the Constitution in that sense did preserve the connection to the old Articles. Now, I'm a fan of the Articles. I'm not a big fan of the current Constitution, but I am adamant that getting rid of this would be far, far worse. I hear libertarians say, well, the Constitution is the root of many of the problems. That may be, but you don't want to get rid of the final thing that offers protections to our basic rights. And if the government continued to acknowledge the debt, it continued to acknowledge the principle of property. What we see now in terms of the social justice warriors is the application of cultural Marxist tactics in order to achieve a political agenda, and that agenda is precisely to overturn the Constitution. So you could lose your property rights, and at the same time, it would allow the people that have driven these debts and driven the financial mess that we're in to escape any responsibility. And you've raised that issue so many times.
So here's why I think the libertarians are all wet.
Oh, I think so too.
When they say the Constitution is a problem, it's all wet. We have not enforced the Constitution.
That's the big problem.
And if you look at the source of the problems, it's the absence of enforcement.
Yes.
So I've always
Absolutely.
said crime that pays is crime that stays.
Absolutely.
The missing money, thanks to Dr. Mark Skidmore and his team from Michigan State University, the missing money, as documented on our website with government documents from 2 agencies. Remember, there are 21 covered agencies. 2 of those agencies, which I suspect are the worst, but I don't know that, we haven't checked the other 19, have $21 trillion of missing money.
That's obscene.
$21 trillion. That is $1 trillion more than the total debt of the United States. Now, I appreciate that an undocumentable adjustment does not represent cash. But I also would say if you refuse since 1996 to produce audited financial statements as required by law, your financials are meaningless.
Exactly.
Okay? You're a liar. You're a criminal enterprise.
Right.
Nothing. Now, if you simply sat down, and this is what Congresswoman McKinney and I talked about, if you simply sit down and enforced the appropriation clause and the war clause of Article 1 of the Constitution.
Right.
So Article 1 in the war clause says Congress has to authorize each war.
Yes.
Now, we put into place a blanket authorization after 9/11 that basically said, okay, you can run around the world and kill anybody and do whatever you want, including using drones to assassinate people who've had no due process, including American citizens.
Yeah, so they've set up a star chamber.
Right. So they've set up a global star chamber.
Yes.
Where Congress is authored to do whatever you want.
Yeah.
In violation of the Constitution.
Right.
The second thing they've done is they've said, okay, and this started in fiscal 1998, you can spend as much money as you want, whatever you want. You can issue as much fraudulent securities as you want.
Yep.
In defiance of the appropriation clause that says Congress has to appropriate it for it to be spent, and says you have to provide disclosure from time to time. So you look at the libertarians, I would say the failure to enforce those two things is the source of most problems.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would
Because
definitely agree with that.
You and I could sit down with people that we totally disagree with on almost every issue. But if they will just agree that the money has to be spent honestly and has to be disclosed, most problems are going to go away.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the libertarians get too involved in philosophical discussions and are not really looking at the reality of the situation.
I think most libertarians are terrified to look at reality.
I think
so they go around in circles because they don't want to face the fact that they're scaredy cats.
No, they don't. And what they're offering doesn't really address the situation. The situation is, it may be a flawed document. I think it is, but flaws or no flaws, it does have protections, and it does have an aspect of covenant that is not being observed. And when it's not observed, we see the mess that results.
Right. So my attitude is enforce the Constitution.
Enforce it. Yeah, absolutely.
After you've finished enforcing it, if you don't like it, then we can discuss improving it.
Right.
But until you're willing to enforce the things that we like.
I wouldn't even say I would be willing to discuss improving the Constitution because, again, this takes us back to what I think the fundamental problem is. We're in a culture where the political class itself has no real grounding in the conventions of law and jurisprudence that led to the Constitution.
Right. They don't believe in the law.
They don't believe in it. And secondly, we've got a popular culture that, regardless of what such a convention might produce, they'll spin it so it sounds good, and people will be stampeded into accepting something that really is not a workable document. So I think the culture has to change, and it has to change, if I can be blunt, in a traditional direction before we even contemplate touching the document and touching the system of government.
Well, right now, the Constitution represents a covenant that we all share and agree to.
Right.
And the reality is, if you tear it down, there will be no new agreement. There won't be. What there will be is chaos, and there will be the ability of the people who stole all the money to buy everything for pennies on the dollar.
Yep.
Finally, the third quarter equity overview, and I return to the same themes. The planet equity, we have a long-term bull market in equity, and I explain why. And as I said, I think this is part of the multiplanetary civilization. And within this, it's exceptionally important that you align with the primary trends and have ways of approaching this that, instead of trying to predict what might happen, that allows you to deal with various scenarios. Because there's no doubt that even though I think we have a long-term bull market, the risks continue to rise and the change continues to accelerate. I want to take a look at the big picture on the equity markets. This is something I've consistently come back and looked at over the last few years. It started with our discussion of planet equity in both the 2013 and 14 annual wrap-ups. I believe that we're shifting to an equity model planet-wide, and equity markets are going to continue to grow. This is an integral part of both globalization and becoming a multiplanetary civilization. If you are interested, I would suggest particularly new subscribers go back and check out the annual wrap-up since 2013. In 2013 and 2014, we talked about planet equity and as part of the globalization process, and then focused on space in the annual wrap-up 2015, published in January 2016.
and then did the third quarter 2015 on the Chinese stock market. And then in the third quarter 2016 looked very hard at the screening industry. And then, of course, the annual wrap-up for 2016 that we did in January included a lot on what food has meant in the equity markets and why that might be changing. And, of course, each wrap-up has a review of the financial charts for that quarter or year to date. And remember, I also post charts that I track every Sunday on the website. Now, you have to log in to see them, but if you go back through the wrap-ups, there should be an extraordinary amount of information to help you sort of track what we're saying about planet equity and the big picture on the equity markets. To give you an overview, statistically, in 1990, the global equity markets were about 11 trillion. China was $0 of that. The Chinese markets reopened right in 1990, so they were 0% of that 11 trillion. Today, the global equity markets are approximately 70 to 80 trillion. The U.S. being about 27 trillion of that, China now 8 trillion, which is about 10% of the global float. If you look at China's growth since 1990, that is quite remarkable. And of course, if you want to include Hong Kong, you're talking about all of China representing 11 to 12 trillion. And if you look at the growth rate in Asia, both of companies going public in both the subcontinent and East Asia, that's where a lot of the growth is coming. It's really important when you step back and look at the global equity markets to realize that Asia is converging with the G7 in terms of per capita income, but the emerging markets are not. And so there are two stories in the emerging markets. One in Asia, where per capita incomes are growing and are expected to converge with G7, and the rest of the emerging markets where they're not. So that's one of the reasons why the rising Asian consumer is such a powerful primary trend. And if you haven't spent any time in Asia, I really constantly try and encourage people in my network to just get up and go, because you have to see it to understand how dynamic it is.
So there you have it, the wrap-ups for 2017 Global Harvest, The Clash of Civilizations, Enforce the Constitution, and Control 101. Producing these wrap-ups has been a very rich experience for the entire Solari team, and we want to thank you for all your ideas, your input, and your encouragement. We're going to publish our 2017 annual wrap-up in January 2018. It's coming up. It builds on our 2017 wrap-up, so if you've not had a chance to access them, the holidays are an excellent time to sit back and get your perspective with the 2017 Solari Report wrap-ups.